I work in very transdisciplinary crossroads of fields from media arts and dance technology to performance and music, from philosophy and queer theory to a number of other fields, technosciences and so on. So what you will hear today has to do with very much with this being in between different territories and with moving in between things. The task for my little talk today is actually quite ambitious because it's about nearly undoing, let's say, roughly 2,500 years of metaphysics of form. It's about redefining this notion of virtuality and taking it back in a way to what it used to be. Virtual in philosophy and in other fields is equivalent to potential. So how can we rethink virtuality, and then we will see how this links to notions of matter and embodiment, and how can this notion of virtual understood as potential help us to redefine all these things? I've been working for some time now on what I call a kinetic ontology, which means to understand, to produce an ontology and understanding of the world in terms of movement. How is it that we can understand reality in terms of forces in motion, movements of different kinds? One way that is important for me to go around this is to understand how movement has always got a certain quality that is not yet actualized. So how is movement always exceeding, to a certain extent, its own actualizations into forms? What are these potentials of movement? This would be the virtuality of movement, the potentials that are permanently exceeding. Plenty of important thinkers nowadays, like Brian Massumi, Erin Manning, and other people, are rethinking virtuality in this manner along the tradition of Bergson, Deleuze, and others. There's other people who have been also rethinking materiality from a very different perspective, but also as something that is in formation. Materiality itself also is a process of materialization. How is this process of materialization a process of formation? How is matter something that we can only understand, the materiality of bodies, of whatever? It is form that accounts for the intelligibility of matter. Movement is always exceeding the actualizations of matter, so movement is that which accounts for matter never to be fully materialized. What are the potentials for matter to become something other than what it is now? This is a highly important political question if we want to understand how certain power regimes operate through materialization, through formation. So virtual is equivalent to potential, and potential is equivalent to the real. Well, I think this has to do with certain processes in which perception is choreographed in such a way that pattern and form is highlighted, as opposed to this non-actualized potentials of movement that are exceeding. So presence, as it has been defined in information society, has a lot to do with fixing only on the actualized potentials of movement, which means on the fixity of form. For me, the important thing is not so much form as the already actualized, but rather the way in which movement is always exceeding these actualized potentials. How can we then arrive to a rather different account of presence? So if telepresence and presence in information society have been mostly associated to issues of recognizability of patterns and forms, what happens there, for instance, with the non-verbal resonances of our embodied communication? This is something that I'm quite interested in as well. As some of you may know, in non-verbal communication studies, it's a common assumption that about 93% of what's going on in an interpersonal conversation is non-verbal. My question is, what happens with this 93%? Is this merely underlining the meaning of words, or is it generating completely different kinds of resonances that are exceeding the structures and processes of meaning production? This is what I propose you to think about, of course. I do think that these bodily, non-verbal aspects of communication are not at the surface of meaning production. perception, but are permanently undermining meaning production and generating irreducible resonances. The process in which the movements of the bodies and all these verbal movements, the movements of the sounds, the movement of our gestures, and so on and so forth, are permanently entering into always not yet actualized, not yet defined fields that challenge the given fields of intelligibility and form. What has happened to this 93% of resonances? Well, I think this is one of the greatest questions possibly that we face nowadays, because this presumption of erasure of corporeality that underlies information society in its entirety is possibly the most problematic issue, as one which is never fulfilling its presumption of erasure of the body, but is producing bodies in ever more standardized manners. So the result of this presumption of information to erase the body is not to erase it, but to produce it in ever more serialized and standardized manner. So let's just go on into some projects in which I've tried to deal with what I might call abstract presence and telepresence, or amorphous presence and telepresence. Let's see now the ETP project, which was this European teleplatters in which, I was just a Spanish co-organizer of a larger European project. This is the first time I tried to develop more specifically this notion of abstract telepresence. What you see there, in this project there was something very peculiar about the way in which we were dealing with telepresence, and that was that we were never streaming video or audio. We were only streaming the very abstracted data of motion analysis that was happening through an infrared camera that was on the ceiling, aligned with a projector. So that's why you see there's the projection on the floor. The floor, then the projection area acts as the interactive stage, so to speak. And the infrared camera can look at what bodies are doing, physically present bodies are doing in that space. Now, the peculiar thing is that we were only sending to the other, we were always connecting 4 cities together, which is quite a complex feat, I must say. It's already complicated to connect 2, but this time it was always 4 at a time. And what we were sending from one city to another was never the recognizable image of a subject moving in space, but it was the abstracted algorithms of the contour of what the camera was looking at. So it was a rather abstract contour, which for me was an interesting exercise into undoing the human form, in a way, which is something I rather like to do. So rather than trying to reiterate the recognizability of human forms, I rather like to play with what happens when you have silhouettes, contours, that could almost be human, but are not quite. There is a very interesting point there, this frontier of the intelligible, where it starts to become a bit uncanny and a bit uncomfortable, where you start not to be able to recognize quite what's going on. I think that is precisely the place where these resonances start again to open up, where they had been foreclosed. Maybe it's not the only place, but it's one of them. So here, what you see there to the right is the abstracted contour of someone who was in one of the other 3 cities that were interacting in the process. The different elements of the processing of the images, color, the intensity, whatever, the blurring of the contours and other things, and also the spatialized soundscape that was being generated in real time, and it was always never just a stereo landscape. This, for me, is a very important, crucial question. Not to have a centralized hearing, like also not to have a centralized vision, if possible. This is interesting with the floor projection, because you stop having like this centralization of vision on a square wall, which I have also used, of course, but suddenly you become immersed into something that is more decentralized. But it's very important for me to have spatialized sound as well. Because hearing is always, as an embodied process, is always a non-centralized process. And I think the way in which we have produced this standardized, serialized perception of sound from the stereo system is quite a terrible way of standardizing perception, and oral perception in this case. As you may know, in contemporary music in the 20th century, there have been enormous ranges of experimentations with spatialization of sound, never for the sake of simulating existing counts of soundscapes like you get in 3D cinema, you know, where you see the space, whatever, what do you call them, like in Star Wars, the spaceships going from here to there, and so you have these effects. What you get in 3D cinema, for example, in terms of spatialized sounds, is always mostly for the sake of simulating the effects of what the movie is showing. But what went on in new music was rather a different process of generating spaces, sound spaces that had never existed before, which is rather the kind of thing that I'm interested in doing with digitality in a way as well. So here, the sound that you get and the way the images are processed, not only the fact that the contours that you see are from the people that are moving in similar spaces in the other cities at the same time. The way in which the whole thing processes has to do with movement relations that are established between the people in the different cities. So it is again a certain degree of abstraction of the actual movement parameters as they are being analyzed in an always reductionist manner, and this is something I'm very critical with, the way in which motion analysis systems are always extremely reductionistic. And I've been using them for years. But we just have to be aware of this problem. And this problem is a very large scale, and because this is not only happening in dance and technology or in motion capture systems, this happens with every single interface that we're using in our everyday life, always capturing movement in one way or another. And you're always having to enter the regime of movement that the interface is proposing you to enter. So if the mouse moves in an X, Y coordinate with a certain degree of resolution, you have to enter it. You can't do it because also the mouse and the keyboard make you enter a realm of linear one-to-one relations where you press and something happens, which is something radically different. So how can we recover or even expand these resonances, these irreducible resonances of bodies in motion, going back to the digital? Here you can see each color represents one of the cities. So I think the green was Dresden, the blue was Prague, the red was in Sweden, and the yellow is the Madrid person who is actually physically present. And you see now all the lines are very blurry or multiplied because they were all together in a way. So the proximity in this case was the parameter that we were using to generate a sense of presence. Now it wasn't quite working. Why? Because it was too abstract in a way. It became a visual effect. Which means, since we live in a culture of visual effects, which is in itself a problem, how do we produce something that, being, let's say, amorphous rather than abstract, is perceived as a presence? This is something quite interesting. It's not so easy. You can easily fall into just perceiving an effect, and that's not a presence as far as I am concerned. Well, it might be, but a different kind of presence. So I will show you, this is more of the same. Well, this is another environment. Tomorrow I might be able to show some more videos and things, but I will now go on quickly. Where we actually had abstract avatars. So in this case, the other cities were represented by biomorphous architectural 3D structures that were transforming with the different movement relations that were established between the people in the different cities. So the more this person physically present would approach the other abstract avatars, the more these would, for example, deform. I will now move on to other projects. So this was a different, very, very different project I've been working on for years now, in which I also did some telepresence experiences, although it's not the main focus of the project yet. You can go on. These are architectures, I can't talk about them today. But, so in this project, I was using, surveillance cameras placed all over the body. And what you see there projected and what the body is looking at is the actual image that is being projected without any processing, just pure analog video, just being projected in real time. Now what's very interesting here is that there's a transposition of perception. So the cameras that are now anywhere looking at the skin become the eyes. So the body sees through these cameras and the body moves through these cameras. So what transforms here is proprioception. Proprioception is a particular sense, one of the more than 15 senses that we are acknowledged to have and which by far are not the only ones. So one very important thing for me is the way in which perception has been structured, especially since the Renaissance with the invention of perception, which according to many people was eventually the most important event in the Renaissance. The invention of perception and other technologies of vision, of a rationalized vision, which is still utterly present in all the technologies of visual control that are operating nowadays, from radars to 3D simulations, all kinds of things, are still working on the algorithmic kind of rationalization of vision that perspective the Renaissance produced. Now, what I think this structured most importantly was not just our seeing, which is a very important thing already, so to understand, as posthumanism has taught us, how technologies structure seeing, how technologies structure our thinking, knowledge, and our bodies, and so on. So it's very interesting how suddenly, when the eyes are no longer placed in the face, in a fixed framing, with a certain kind of perspective and distance, and so on, the whole perception of the body changes so radically that it can no longer still be the body of a subject through telepresence processes. So what was going on through Skype or whatever, what was being projected were these amorphous, what I call post-anatomical movements or microdances of the body, which the other person was seeing. And the voice that you hear, and tomorrow I will show some videos, now it's impossible, was my own voice processed, or the body's voice processed in real time, so that it became not quite intelligible as a human voice. So that, interestingly, generated a more presence-like feeling, I think, because there's the skin. The skin here is the frontier of the intelligible, the frontier that allows you to have some kind of presence going on there. That, insofar as the skin is not quite recognizable, what kind of skin, what kind of body it is, there this presence starts to shift from the recognizable into some more alien and interesting kinds of fields. So for me, this is a more successful project in terms of how to produce an account of presence that goes away from intelligibility, but still hints at some account of presence of some sort. Let's quickly go through a few other things. Well, these are other versions of the same, which I did in outdoor places, projecting the micro disabilities. The last version I did this year in Chile was without an audience, and this is very crucial for me as well, to avoid the spectacularity of the spectator position. So here, I was approaching the people who were going into a space where I was one by one, and I was de-visualizing them. So I was approaching them with the cameras, and they were becoming the amorphous entity, and they were seeing how they were being de-visualized by this alien creature that was suddenly getting near to them. I think this issue of avoiding the spectacular framings is an important one. Also, if one wants to transform perceptions and proprioceptions and embodied kinds of relations. Okay. Well, this is. I will just quickly go through. We can go on now. This is just read things. Well, go backwards. Well, yeah. Keep that for a moment. Just very quickly, we had this call for projects called Devisualize in the group which I coordinate in Media Lab Prague in Madrid, which is called Common Body. Now, Devisualize, of course, it was a provocation in some way, because as you may know, visualizing is very trendy in media arts nowadays, and of course in media culture altogether. Of course, this project was precisely about challenging the implications of not being quite critical enough, what it means to be permanently visualizing everything, which is inherently a control paradigm. I think what happens with these unactualized potentials of movement, which are irreducible to form, of course we cannot visualize them, but how do we set them to motion? This would be the crucial question for me. Metabody is a new project which we are starting hopefully next year with a very large consortium of institutions, 28 from 14 countries, of which hopefully Berkeley is one of the associated partners with PISA. And so this is a previous project, but it illustrates what we are getting to here. Now, in this project, I was working years ago with digital architectures. This is just projections on a translucent screen, so it looks like it were like a holographic projection, something that it's not. The digital structures are transformed interactively or reactively in relation to the movement of the dancer or the performer. As you see, they are quite liquid, amorphous structures, and for me it was very, and still is very important in this kind of projects to never produce the kind of simulation of already known, of already given, replicated to saturation landscapes that one gets in video games, in 3D movies, and this kind of stuff. I think 3D and digital technologies give us enormous potentials to invent new kinds of reality that never existed before. And a reality not only in terms of what we see, if they're represented, but of the relations that we establish with things. So what kinds of embodied relationalities are we establishing with these environments? There's a huge universe there to discover, and unluckily, few efforts have been done in that direction. Mostly in the direction of simulating and replicating already given representations of reality, not reality itself. What is reality? So, in this project, we want to explore. So, this is like a further stage of the same process. How do these digital architectures eventually sediment into potential physical architectures? But always through exploring rather amorphous kinds of environments where the body doesn't find predefined affordances. An affordance is the quality of an object that allows you to, or invites you to interact with it in a particular way. So what happens if we start to develop environments, architectures and objects and things that are not quite intelligible, that are not quite formed, that are even information. So now, as you see, we've done the leap from information to in-formation, from things that are already formed to things that are always information, or even a formation, which are never quite formed, which are never quite sedimenting into a given transform. So this would be the structure of the 5 years project. Well, the first year, we bring together systems for motion analysis and so on in a very critical manner. And the second year, we would start investigating these movement relationships with digital amorphous environments. In the third year, we would start transposing these to physical kinds of architectures, wearable architectures, or modular architectures. In the fourth year, we would start integrating these modules into a larger architectural structure, and this would eventually become a self-contained mobile structure for outer spaces that would tour different cities in the last year. What this structure would contain, this is the interesting question of course, would be, well, spaces that would transform permanently in the relation with the bodies that are moving in these spaces. They will be transforming not only in their digital aspects of projections and sounds, but also even in the physical structure. We would bring in elements of experimental architecture of different kinds. And so this would be one part of this mobile laboratory, a laboratory of embodiment, how to produce kinds of space, of non-linear time space, a way of a laboratory, an observatory, a mobile observatory of the kinds of standardized corporealities that information society is disseminating everywhere. So the ways in which people are more and more reproducing the movements, or the movements disseminated through the choreographies of commercial music videos, or through systems like Dance Central, which I'm sure some of you know, this sophisticated video game in which you enter a competition in which you win if you are able to replicate best the movements done by an avatar who is reproducing a commercial music choreography, reduced to positions of movement recognized through a system called Kinect, which for me is a radical way of militarizing our affects in the level of communication, leisure, and so on and so forth. So I think we have very highly problematic issues in terms of how bodies and affects are choreographed permanently in information society. And so the question of how to dechoreograph them is an important one that we can potentially answer from fields like dance and technology or telematic performance and so on and so forth, where we provide other kinds of presence and other kinds of embodied reality. Okay, so I think I'm well over time. Maybe tomorrow I will have the opportunity to show other videos of other things and so on, but otherwise, thank you very much.
I appreciated the really we take for granted these interfaces. We take for granted how we engage with these technologies, and you realize now that I've been working in this lab and working with cameras so much and computers, you realize that so much of how it is set up, the technology itself, really impacts how you as a body, as a mover, engages with it. So I think it's really brave and interesting to try and dismantle that or break that apart, or at least keep those questions coming into how we are making our technologies. So I want to really appreciate that, what you're saying.
Yeah, just one question that I guess speaks to art in general about its exclusivity, especially with this type of high-tech art. How are we going to affect people in their daily lives and change their perspectives?
Well,
how do we do that?
Descartes has affected us. We are living in a Cartesian society. So the whole technological paradigms on which we are based, I'm not going to say that they were totally invented by a philosopher. There's more people involved in this process. But still, he had a huge impact on what we are experiencing today. So, you know, this is a very long-term process. We are sitting here, for me this is a hugely important issue, even in political terms, although I would call it a politics of laboratory in a way. So we are producing here new paradigms for hugely important questions. We don't know how or when this will, but I don't never think of these issues in terms of them becoming popularized, because I think the problem that we live in is that we live in a populistic kind of universalistic framework of culture, which is what I think is problematic itself. So I think what we need is a new kind of molecular, if you want to speak in Deleuzian terms, kinds of disseminations of things that are always diversifying in such a way that you never get a general paradigm that is valid for everybody, which would be always a mistake, a problem. So, you know, how do we generate a critical culture of technology that makes that what I'm giving you or telling you now doesn't become something that you replicate, but this just gives you or impinges upon you in such a way that you produce something radically different. But still we are connected in some strange way, and then someone sees what you're doing and they produce again something that you would never have thought. So this is the kind of paradigm that I think would be important. And there the issue of movement again becomes crucial. So for me choreography is a very important paradigm to understand how bodies and knowledges and thinkings and affects are choreographed all the time. Because since I think reality is always in motion, motion can never be fully stopped, but it can be choreographed. This is the important, interesting issue. So power can never fully operate through fixing motion, because motion never stops, as far as I think it. But it can be...
We think we're still, but we're never...
We're never completely still.
We're not. We're rotating on the earth and we're shifting.
And even at molecular levels, because movement is happening at all sorts of scales. Yeah. But then what can be done is to choreograph movements so that we start aligning ourselves into pre-given choreographies that seem at a certain point unavoidable. And there we have a problem, of course. So how can we start shifting from these choreographies in ways that are perhaps we need to add new registers to our political kinds of strategies. I think we have been very active for decades now on confrontational strategies that make visible things that were not visible, and so on and so forth. I think this is still important, and I do that as well. But how about starting to set to motion things that are never quite visible, but are intensely moving? But they are escaping the regimes of control, of representation, of simulation, of visualization, and so on and so forth. What happens if we start undoing certain choreographies in such a way that something not quite legible starts to happen, and suddenly the time-space linearity starts to shift in a way that you can't quite identify, but something is going on there. This is the kind of thing that I'm interested in.
Improvisation exercise of flocking, where you're just in a room, and then the group starts collecting and following, and then all of a sudden you're in a trajectory, and then it starts to shift inside of itself, and then you're into something else. You know, it's not done by someone or something. It just is capturing the motion of the entity.
Yeah, flocking I think is an interesting thing, but not in order to simulate birds, but to reinvent motion, the human motion, to produce a post-human kind of motion in the human motion. That's an interesting thing.
All right. Any final thoughts? Great. Thank you.
Thank you.